Every single holiday, my parents used gifts not to celebrate, but to shame me. This year, though, I finally gave them a present they'll never forget. And I did it right in front of everyone. I'm 28 now, and honestly, for as long as I can remember, Christmas in my family wasn't about joy or togetherness. It was a brutal performance, a power play orchestrated by my parents. They turned gift-giving into this grand, humiliating spectacle, always making sure they looked like the perfect, doting parents to my younger brother and sister. Christmas morning for them meant piles of expensive presents. Shiny new gadgets, designer clothes, the latest gaming consoles. One year my brother even got a car. A whole car. And me? My gifts were never just bad. They were carefully chosen weapons of humiliation. A pack of off-brand socks. A thrift store sweater 2 sizes too big. Self-help books about finding direction in life. When I was just 16, they handed me a weight loss guide for teenage boys. Even though I wasn't even overweight. I remember sitting there clutching that stupid book, while my siblings unwrapped their brand new iPhones. My parents just beamed at me, waiting for my thank you. The room was full of family, relatives who would laugh awkwardly, or just look away, pretending they didn't see the blatant favoritism. If I dared to show even a flicker of disappointment, oh, they had their rehearsed line ready. "You should be grateful for what you get," they'd announce to the whole room. Some kids don't get anything at all. It was the same script every year. If I smiled and played along, I was finally maturing. If I looked upset, I was spoiled and selfish. It didn't matter what I did, they always won. And my other parent? They never stepped in. They'd just sit there sipping their coffee, telling me later quietly, "Don't take it personally." But how could I not? The second I turned 18, I started building my escape. I took extra shifts, saved every single penny, and the moment I had enough for a tiny apartment, I was gone. I stopped going home for Christmas, always citing work or travel plans. It took a few years, but I slowly, painstakingly carved out a life for myself. A career, my own place, a genuine sense of peace. Then came the guilt trips. "You're ruining the family," my parents would wail over the phone. "Your siblings miss you. Do you really want to break us apart like this?" It took a while, but they wore me down. I actually convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, after all these years, things had changed. Maybe they had changed. So I agreed to come home for Christmas that year. Big mistake. Huge. The decorations were the same, of course. Twinkling lights, a towering tree. A table groaning under the weight of expensive gifts. My parents greeted me with smiles that never quite reached their eyes. The gifts were handed out one by one. My sister got a designer purse. My brother a top-of-the-line laptop. Then it was my turn. My parents, wide grins plastered on their faces, handed me a single plain envelope. I opened it. Inside was a printed-out list. Life tips for late bloomers. Certain lines had been highlighted, advice about better money management, and taking responsibility for your future. I just stared at the paper, then looked up. My parents were watching, waiting. They wanted me to crack, to lash out, to make a scene so they could deliver their favorite line. But I didn't give them the satisfaction. I smiled. I tucked the paper back into the envelope, and I thanked them. They looked almost disappointed. You see, they wanted me to play the role of the ungrateful son, but I had already started planning my own little play. Over the years, I'd worked my way up the corporate ladder. I made smart investments, stayed out of debt, and built a financial stability my parents had never managed. By the way, if you're still with me and enjoying this wild ride, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, there are more unbelievable stories coming. My parents, on the other hand, spent money recklessly: big vacations, designer clothes, expensive furniture. They always flaunted a wealth they didn't really have. I'd started noticing cracks in their carefully constructed image. Then a few months ago I found out the truth. I was catching up with an old family friend who worked in finance. Casually, they mentioned something about pre-foreclosure notices, and my parents' names had come up. My heart actually skipped a beat. I checked for myself. And there it was. Their house. The very house where they'd humiliated me every single year, where they'd wielded their power over me for so long, was about to be taken by the bank. It didn't take long to confirm everything. My parents had always been terrible with money, but this time their reckless spending had finally caught up, and the bank wasn't giving them a way out. The moment I saw that notice, a cold clarity washed over me. I made a decision. I met with a lawyer, went through all the legal channels, and positioned myself perfectly. By the time the foreclosure was official, I was ready. I placed a winning bid at the auction. The house was mine. This year, Christmas would be different. My parents had always used gifts as weapons, making the holidays about control, about making sure I knew my place. But this time I had the ultimate gift for them. A neatly wrapped manila envelope. Inside, proof that I now owned their house. And this Christmas, right in front of everyone, I was going to give them the one thing they had given me my whole life. A lesson in humiliation. The Christmas gathering unfolded exactly as it always did. lavish decorations, a dining table overflowing with food, and my parents in full performance mode, ensuring everyone knew they were the perfect hosts. They floated around the room laughing, fixing plates, acting like they weren't drowning in debt. The gift exchange began. My parents, making a huge show of their thoughtfulness, handed out presents. My younger brother unwrapped a sleek new gaming laptop. My sister gasped over a high-end designer handbag. Even my other parent received something extravagant. An expensive watch they turned over in their hands, almost like they weren't sure how they'd afforded it. Then it was my turn. My parents smiled, handing me a single wrapped package. That same patronizing grin, you know, the one they always wore when they were about to make a point at my expense. I pulled at the cheap wrapping paper. Inside, a self-help book about forgiveness and a dollar store planner. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably. My aunt, the only one in the family who never played into my parents' act, raised an eyebrow. I just smiled, held up the book, and nodded. Thank you. Their grins faltered just for a second. They had expected me to react differently. Maybe a flash of hurt, an embarrassed outburst. But I had played this game too many times. I tucked the book back into the box and placed it beside me. Then I reached under my chair. I pulled out my gift for them. A neatly wrapped box bigger than the one they'd given me, tied with a gold ribbon. The second my parents saw it, their expressions changed. They lit up, eyes gleaming. They probably thought I had finally come to my senses, that I'd given in, maybe even splurged on something extravagant to make up for all the years of ungratefulness. They carefully untied the ribbon and pulled open the box. For a moment they didn't register what they were looking at. Their manicured nails flipped through the pages slowly, their faces shifting from pleased to confused, then a dawning horror. They stopped. Their mouths twitched. Their fingers clenched. The color drained from their faces. The room, which had been filled with laughter and chatter just moments before, went utterly silent. I leaned back in my chair, speaking clearly, making sure everyone could hear. Since the house was going into foreclosure, I stepped in and bought it before the bank could sell it to a stranger. So now, I own it. A sharp intake of breath. My other parent froze. My brother and sister looked between me and my parents like they just walked into the middle of a horror movie. My aunt, who had been sipping her wine, actually let out a quiet laugh and quickly covered her mouth. My parents' hands shook as they flipped through the papers again, their eyes darting over the legal documents, desperately hoping to find a loophole, a mistake, anything to undo what they were reading. But there was nothing. It was real. Then the screaming started. They shot up from their chairs, gripping the papers so tightly that they crumpled in their hands. Words poured out of them, fast, furious accusations, insults, pure outrage. How dare you do this to us? You think you're so smart, don't you? Buying our home. You're trying to humiliate us in front of our family. It wasn't just anger. It was full-blown hysteria. They slammed the papers onto the table, their chests heaving. Some of the younger cousins, watching from across the room, looked scared. My brother clenched his jaw but didn't say anything. My sister, still clutching her new designer bag, sat frozen, like she was afraid of getting dragged into it. My parents turned, looking for someone to back them up. They locked eyes with my other parent, waiting for them to step in to defend them. But for the first time in my life, my other parent actually spoke up against them. I told you this was going to happen, they muttered, their voice tired. You never listen. The rage on my parents' faces flickered for just a second, replaced by something else, something closer to panic. They turned back to me, voices shaking. You can't just do this. You can't just take our home away from us. I didn't react. I reached for my glass of water, took a slow sip and set it back down before I spoke. I didn't take it, I said, keeping my voice utterly calm. You lost it. A few people in the room looked away, pretending to check their phones. Others were watching closely, barely blinking. My parents' hands balled into fists. You wanted this, they hissed. You waited for this moment. I didn't argue. The meltdown escalated fast. My parents grabbed the stack of papers and threw them across the room. Pages scattered over the floor, sliding under chairs and across the carpet. They were shaking, their entire bodies vibrating with rage. What do you expect us to do? I didn't flinch. I expect you to either start paying rent, or find another place to live. Silence. For the first time my brother spoke. His voice was tight. So what happens now? I leaned back unfazed. That's up to them. My parents' breathing was ragged. Then, as if trying to regain some shred of control, they straightened up, smoothed out their clothes. They looked at me, eyes burning. We will never pay rent to you, they said. Like it was a declaration. Like they thought saying it out loud made it true. But it didn't. Because in my hands I held all the power now. And whether they liked it or not, things were about to change. The moment my parents threw those foreclosure papers across the room, Christmas was officially over. The stunned silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. A few relatives tried to salvage the evening, awkwardly refilling their drinks or forcing polite conversations, but it was useless. The energy had shifted irreversibly. My parents stormed upstairs, slamming their bedroom door behind them so hard that one of the ornaments on the Christmas tree rattled off and hit the floor. My brother shot me a murderous look, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, while my sister sat frozen, gripping the handles of her new designer bag like it was a life preserver. My other parent just sighed and rubbed their temples. The room cleared out fast after that. Some relatives exchanged quick goodbyes, clearly not wanting to get involved. A few, though, looked at me with something close to respect, like they'd just witnessed a long overdue reckoning unfold. My aunt gave me a small nod before slipping out the door, her smirk barely concealed. As I gathered my things to leave, my brother followed me into the hallway, cutting me off before I could make it to the front door. His face was red, his voice low and angry. He demanded to know why I had done this, why I had humiliated our parents in front of everyone. He wasn't asking because he didn't understand. He was asking because he didn't want to admit that he had benefited from their favoritism his whole life. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just let him rant, let him spit out his accusations, let him call me heartless. Then I simply walked around him and left. Later that night, when the house was quiet, my other parent found me outside by my car. The cold air bit at my skin as they stood there, hands shoved deep into their pockets. They weren't angry, just utterly exhausted. They admitted that they had known this was coming, that they had tried to warn my other parent, tried to tell them they couldn't keep pretending their finances weren't a disaster. But they never listened. They never wanted to listen. I waited for them to ask me to back down, to reconsider, but they didn't. They just shook their head and told me, I wish things had gone differently. Then they turned and walked back inside. The fallout didn't stop there. Over the next few days the calls started. First from relatives. Some were cautious, feeling out where they stood in the family divide. Others came right out and admitted that they had always seen how my parents treated me, and while they wouldn't say it out loud, they thought they deserved it. Then came the calls from my parents. Except they didn't call me directly. They called my workplace. One morning my boss pulled me aside, barely able to keep a straight face as he told me about the voicemail they had left. They had ranted about my unstable behavior, warned him that I was manipulative and dangerous, and tried to convince him to reconsider my employment. My boss deleted the message before even finishing it. He told me it sounded like a bitter, desperate attempt at revenge. It didn't stop there. My parents tried to act like nothing had happened. They stayed in the house, going about their lives as if it wasn't legally mine. They didn't acknowledge the foreclosure, didn't acknowledge the Christmas disaster. They carried on like I had simply made up the entire thing. My sister started distancing herself, torn between the messy reality unfolding in front of her and the truth she had been trying to ignore. My brother? He went the opposite route. He dug his heels in, furious at me, fully believing my parents' version of events, that I had blindsided them, betrayed them, and torn the family apart out of spite. It became clear then, my parents had no intention of taking responsibility, no intention of moving out, no intention of acknowledging what had happened. So I gave them a legal reminder. The first eviction notice was delivered a few weeks later. The paperwork was airtight. They had no legal claim to the house, no lease, no standing, but they still refused to acknowledge it. That's when they tried one last desperate move. A relative reached out, claiming my parents wanted to make peace over lunch. The whole thing was staged, obviously an attempt to guilt-trip me, to manipulate me into backing down. I declined. That same night I got a long rambling voicemail. The tone shifted wildly. First they were sobbing, begging me to fix this. Then they were furious, blaming me for ruining the family. By the end they were demanding that I undo everything. As if I could magically reverse the foreclosure, as if they hadn't ignored every single warning sign. I deleted the voicemail without responding. I made my boundaries clear. If they wanted to talk, they could do it through an attorney. They never reached out again. It was clear now. This wasn't going to end quietly. My parents weren't going down without a fight. The eviction notice arrived, but my parents acted like it didn't even exist. They went into full-blown denial mode, telling anyone who would listen that it was all a misunderstanding. They spun the story their way, claiming I was confused and bluffing to make a point. According to them, there was no way I'd actually follow through. They told my siblings that I had some kind of vendetta, that I was trying to punish them for being strict parents. My brother ate up every word. The calls started first, then the texts. At first, they were disguised as concern, asking if I had really thought this through. That didn't last long. The messages quickly turned into full-blown rants about how I was destroying the family and making our parents homeless over a stupid grudge. I ignored them. Then the messages got nastier. He called me selfish, cruel, a heartless traitor who was ruining Christmas for everyone. He sent long, angry paragraphs one after another, sometimes in the middle of the night. I blocked him. My sister, on the other hand, took a different approach. She wasn't angry, just hesitant. She admitted that our parents had been unfair for years, but pleaded with me to find another way. She wanted me to be the bigger person, to stop things before they got worse. I didn't argue with her. I just reminded her that our parents had already ignored every warning, and that this was the inevitable result. My sister went quiet after that, not picking a side, but slowly pulling away from the situation. My parents didn't stop there. When they realized they weren't getting through to me, they turned to my other parent. They demanded that they fix this. But for once, they didn't take their side. They refused to get involved, told them they had brought this on themselves. That threw them off completely. They had always expected them to back them up, to play peacemaker. So they tried something else. A few days later, I got a letter from a lawyer. Except calling them a lawyer was generous. It was a family friend of theirs who probably Googled eviction law 10 minutes before drafting the letter. The wording was weak, full of vague threats and dramatic language about a son's duty and emotional distress. I sent it straight to my lawyer. He laughed. Then he reassured me. They had no case. No lease, no legal claim, nothing. If they wanted to fight this, they'd be wasting money they didn't have. That must have been the moment reality finally set in, because that night they left me a voicemail. Their voices shook. They were sobbing, begging me to fix this, to undo it somehow. It was the same cycle they always followed. Rage, denial, then desperation. They tried everything, pleading, blaming, guilt-tripping. I didn't respond. The final eviction notice was served a few days later. The sheriff's department made it official. They had 30 days left. No more excuses. No more games. They had lost. And now they had to face the consequences. The eviction deadline was fast approaching. But instead of looking for a new place, my parents doubled down on their theatrics. They told everyone who would listen that they were being forcibly removed by their own son. The story changed depending on who they were talking to. To some, they were helpless victims abandoned after years of sacrifice. To others, I was some heartless villain who had swooped in to steal the house out from under them. They conveniently left out the part where they had ignored every warning, every overdue bill, every single chance to fix their situation before it reached this point. And then they tried to go after my job again. One morning, my boss pulled me aside, barely containing his amusement. Someone had sent an anonymous email filled with accusations about my unstable behavior and troubling history. It was a mess of lies, clearly an attempt to get me fired. My boss read it out loud, shaking his head, before deleting it on the spot. We both knew exactly who sent it. But my brother took things even further. Since I had blocked him on everything, he found another way to lash out. One evening as I was leaving work, he was waiting in the parking lot. He stood near my car, arms crossed, jaw clenched. I didn't stop. I walked past him like he wasn't even there. That's when he exploded. He started shouting, demanding that I fix this. People turned to look. Security stepped in immediately. When he refused to calm down, they escorted him off the property. HR was notified. They assured me that any further incidents would be handled. That was the last time I saw him. Security called the cops to issue a formal warning. That was the final straw for me. I blocked him on every possible platform. No calls, no texts, nothing. After that, my sister reached out. She apologized for our brother's behavior, but still tried to convince me to be the bigger person. I let her talk, but I didn't waver. Then came my parents' next move. They suddenly decided they wanted to talk. Except instead of reaching out directly, they used our aunt as a messenger. They acted like they were finally ready to make peace, pretending that they just wanted a simple conversation. I didn't fall for it. But then things took a turn. A friend of mine who lived nearby called me one evening with a warning. They had overheard my parents ranting to a neighbor, saying that if they had to leave, they were going to destroy the house first. I didn't take that threat lightly. I hired a property inspector to document everything. Every wall, every fixture, every appliance. I wanted a full record of the house's condition in case they followed through. My lawyer reassured me that if they caused any damage, they could be sued and possibly even arrested. The final eviction deadline was coming fast. I expected them to make a scene, to fight, to drag it out. But no one expected what they did next. On the very last day before they had to leave, my parents made their most unhinged move yet. The eviction deadline was less than 48 hours away when my parents made their most unhinged move yet. I got home from work that evening and immediately noticed something was off. The lock on my apartment door wasn't broken, but it felt different. I stepped inside and that's when I saw it. My drawers had been rifled through, my cabinets left slightly ajar, and a few things were missing. I checked my valuables first, my laptop, jewelry, anything expensive, they were still there. But when I went into my closet, my stomach dropped. A box that had been buried in the back full of old family heirlooms and childhood photos was gone. And so were my spare house keys. I checked my security cam footage. Sure enough, there they were, my parents. They must have still had an old copy of my apartment key from years ago. They had let themselves in while I was at work, taken what they wanted, and left. I called the police immediately and reported the break-in and theft. When they arrived, they took my statement, checked the security footage, and confirmed that my parents had unlawfully entered my apartment. Because they still had an old key, it was considered unauthorized entry rather than a forced break-in, but the stolen items made it a criminal matter. The officers contacted them directly, warning that if they didn't return the stolen property immediately, I could press formal charges for theft. Instead of denying it, they went on a tirade, insisting that the items were rightfully theirs. The police told me they could move forward with an arrest if I wished to pursue it, but I opted to give them a final chance to return the items before escalating further. The next morning, a package showed up at my apartment. Half of my stolen belongings were inside. The rest were still missing. I followed up with the police, and this time they didn't give them another warning. The report was officially processed, and they now had a criminal case on their record. I didn't wait around to see if they would escalate further. That same night, I changed all my locks, got security cameras installed at every entrance, and alerted my landlord. I wasn't taking any chances, but they weren't done. The next morning, eviction day, the police and a court officer arrived at the house to enforce the final removal. A neighbor texted me that my parents were still inside, acting like nothing was happening. When they knocked on the door, they refused to answer. It wasn't until the officers announced they were coming inside that they finally opened it. And then the screaming started. They sobbed. They begged. They wailed that this was their home, that I was kicking them onto the streets. They called me every name in the book, accused me of betraying them, of being a soulless, heartless son. None of it worked. The sheriff's deputies remained firm. The court officer handed them the final paperwork. This was no longer a discussion. Then they turned to me. They locked eyes with me, their faces twisted in pure rage. You'll regret this for the rest of your life. The officers gave them 10 minutes to collect their things. That was when they finally realized there was no way out of this. They grabbed a few bags, shot me one last glare, and left. But the damage was already done. After they were gone, I walked inside the house and my stomach dropped. They had trashed the place before leaving. Windows were broken. Fixtures had been ripped down. Bleach had been poured onto the carpets. The walls had scratches and dents, and the kitchen sink had a massive crack in it. I called my lawyer immediately. Within the week, we filed a property damage lawsuit against them. The estimated cost to repair everything? Over $20,000. As for my parents, they ended up moving in with a distant cousin, one who barely tolerated them. And for the first time in my life, I had something I never thought I'd get: peace. The lawsuit moved fast. My lawyer wasted no time filing for property damages after seeing the absolute mess my parents had left behind. The estimate for repairs? Just over $20,000. They ignored the first legal notice, then the second, but they couldn't ignore the court summons. The court date was expedited, forcing them to deal with the consequences much sooner than they expected. When the day arrived, they walked in with the same tired act they had always used. Tears in their eyes, looking small and pitiful, hoping to win sympathy. They played the victim, claiming they had been forced out of their home, that they were destitute, that they had nowhere to go. They painted me as the villain, the cruel son who had stolen the roof over their head out of spite. But then my lawyer presented the evidence. High-quality photos of the damage, the repair estimates, the documented threats they had made to destroy the house. The judge barely had to deliberate. The ruling was clear. They were found liable and were ordered to pay the full amount in damages. They had 90 days to pay up. The moment the decision was announced, my parents lost it. They jumped to their feet, screaming about how I had set them up, how the entire system was against them. They called me a soulless monster before storming out of the courtroom, slamming the door so hard the judge had to pause before moving on to the next case. But it didn't end there. They refused to pay, no surprise there. My lawyer immediately filed for wage garnishment, but since they had no steady job, that wasn't an option. Instead, we secured a judgment lien against any future assets they might obtain. Translation: if they ever came into money, whether from an inheritance, a settlement, or even their own tax returns, I would get my cut first. After that, I cut all contact. I blocked them. I blocked my brother. I blocked every enabler who tried to guilt-trip me into forgiving them. For the first time in my life, I was truly free. The repairs took time, but eventually the house was restored. My finances remained intact. And my parents, they burned every bridge they had left. They ended up crashing with a distant cousin who barely tolerated them. No one else wanted to take them in. It was a long, painful road, but seeing their faces in that courtroom, knowing I had finally truly broken free from their toxic grasp, it was worth every single moment. I finally have the peace I always craved, a peace they tried to steal from me my entire life. So tell me, after hearing all of this, what would you have done in my place? Have you ever had to cut ties with family to find your own peace? Let me know in the comments below.